Hi, storyteller. What makes for a strong fictional character? Whenever I ask this question of writers and avid readers, I often hear strong characters exert agency. They're flawed. They make interesting or unusual decisions. They have a distinct personality. And of course, the most obvious, they can bench press a cow. But when you stop to consider these, you'll realize they can apply to really weak characters as well. Some weak characters exert agency and pursue goals. They are flawed. It's just that readers happen to not find these flaws engaging. They can make interesting and unusual decisions. It's just that those decisions don't quite feel real or understandable. They might have a distinct personality, but that personality is a turnoff. And not in a villainous kind of way, where you wouldn't want to live on the same block as them, but you'd still want to study them under a microscope. Their personality is just a no. And it pains me to say this, but some weak characters can bench press a cow. I don't think that these answers are wrong per se. I'm just pointing out that they are less of a cause that makes a character great, but more of an effect that an already strong character can have on an audience. So what is the underlying skeleton that holds up these impressions in truly strong characters? There, of course, are a lot of narrative elements that work interdependently to give us our favorite icons. After all, you can't really have a great character out of context. But assuming these other pieces are working decently, the short answer of what really makes for a strong character is a coherent motivation. One that can withstand goal changes and plot twists without making characters feel that they're acting, well, out of character. The long answer is the rest of this video, where I will go into the 3 key elements needed to create this strong character coherence. I'll be covering what actually motivates characters and explaining the difference between wants and character motivation. What role beliefs and misbeliefs play in motivation, and how to integrate a character's motivation smoothly into your plot. As always, I'll be giving plenty of examples to make these concepts more concrete. Let's dig in. What motivates characters? The difference between wants and motivation. First things first, let's make sure we're on the same page about what motivation even is. Motivation is the drive that pushes characters and people toward pursuing a goal. It's simply goal-oriented behavior. That's it. If you've ever been taught how to go about giving characters motivation, you might have been told that first characters must have a want or a yearning for something. I was definitely taught this in my MFA and also in my undergrad creative writing classes. This was to ensure that characters aren't just sitting around navel-gazing, but have a goal. Motivation was then explained as the why behind the want. Why does the character want that? And more often than not, it would boil down to a backstory event, frequently a tragic one. For a simple example, let's say we have a character named Jeremy. Jeremy's want is to open a cow sanctuary. A bit further into the narrative, we get the backstory that when he was a little boy living on a farm, he bonded to this little cute calf. He took really good care of it. But one day he woke up to be told that his cow would be sold to the butcher. Now the reader understands the motivation behind Jeremy's ambitious want. It might even tug on your heartstrings a bit, and this can often work, especially from a reader's perspective. But if this is the main framework we've got from a writer's perspective, it's a bit misguided, and it definitely doesn't safeguard us from writing weak characters. The underlying principles here are confusing wants for goals and explanations for motivation. If you really think about it, we're not motivated by our wants. Chances are you've got lots of things you want to do, and you can absolutely articulate why you want to do them, but you remain utterly unmotivated to do them. The world is filled with uncleaned basements, unlearned languages, unvisited aunts, and unrealized dreams, and so on. This is because we're not motivated by wants or why we want those wants. What we are really motivated by, primarily, is feelings. Our wants then arise from those feelings, not the other way around. We are driven into pursuing certain goals because of the difference between how we feel versus how we want to feel. This goes from the ultra rudimentary, you eat food because the feeling of hunger motivates you, To the more complex, you wear your favorite shirt because it makes you feel happy. To the much more complex, like you buy a souped-up convertible because you feel undesirable. Now, when it comes to real humans, untangling the drivers of our behavior, let alone changing our behavior, can be immensely complex, and let's just say there's a reason why therapists go to school for a really long time. But the good news is that characters are not people. Applying feelings to character motivations is much more simple, and it will give you that grounding that strong characters stand on. So the first key to a coherent character motivation is giving your character an emotional goal. This emotional goal encompasses how they want to feel. It is a positive feeling. Note that your character doesn't know that this is their goal, but you, as the writer, need to know it, and it will shape how you think about your character and how you approach their personalities and their goals. A character who fundamentally wants to feel accepted will approach a problem quite differently from one who wants to feel respected, or proud, or courageous, or powerful. So start with the emotional goal. This concept itself should be pretty simple to grasp. But when you're constructing the emotional goal for your characters, there are 4 major points to keep in mind to really give them the best chance of having the coherent motivation. Point 1. Your character can start perfectly emotionally fulfilled at the beginning until the first inciting incident happens and upsets their emotional alignment. In that case, the inciting incident sets their motivation in motion, and this happens by creating that rift between how they feel and how they want to feel. I will say this is a bit more rare in books in general, but somewhat widespread in the more lighthearted genres like comedic romances. Point 2. The emotional goal should ideally be one adjective. I know some feelings take a couple of words to articulate, like a sense of belonging, for example, but whenever possible, force yourself to stick with one word and definitely refrain from explanations as to why they want to feel that way. Let's take our hypothetical character Jeremy and say that he wants to feel peaceful. That would be it. That's his emotional goal. If you do it right, no one in their right mind will question why a character would want to feel peaceful or connected or valued, and so on. Positive emotions are inherently humanly relatable. Point 3. The non-goal feelings can change throughout the story. So Jeremy wants to feel peaceful. That's his goal. And let's say that his starting feeling is annoyed. So that annoyed feeling is not the emotional goal. It can and often should change in the course of the events that unfold and the decisions that he makes. Characters can have whatever other feelings they need to have as long as they don't land on that emotional goal until the end. And that brings us to the 4th and most important point. Point 4. The emotional goal remains unchanged for the duration of the story. This is the bolt that anchors your characters into the reader's understanding. The story ends once the protagonist's emotional goal is achieved, or once the protagonist irrevocably fails to achieve it. This latter case usually is what happens in tragedies. Let's look at a few examples. In The Hunger Games, Katniss wants to feel safe. Now, I admit it's really hard to apply any writing tool to someone else's already finished work, but I'm still going to venture with safe as Katniss's emotional goal here. It fits given the Hunger Games. So she wants to feel safe, and the story in the first book ends when she finally achieves this goal, however temporarily, by surviving the Hunger Games. For another example, in The Great Gatsby, Jay Gatsby likely wants to feel validated or maybe even valued. The story ends when he irrevocably fails to meet that emotional goal when Daisy rejects him. That novel is indeed a tragedy. For a non-book example, consider Disney's Moana. She wants to feel at home. She feels isolated and restless in the story's beginning. The story ends when Moana achieves her emotional goal and is finally at home traveling the large ocean. If we're dealing with a multiple point of view character story, the whole story might not end when one of the protagonist's emotional goals wraps up. However, then that protagonist's arc is over. For example, consider Ned Stark in A Game of Thrones. I think it could be fair to say that he wants to feel righteous. His head is chopped off pretty much the moment he irrevocably fails to meet that emotional goal by wrongly confessing to be a traitor. That would be an example of a tragic arc. Now, whether you agree with my reconstructions of these characters' emotional goals or not, I hope you understand the point I'm illustrating. The main two things to remember here is that this emotional goal remains unchanged during the course of the story, and the story ends when the emotional goal is resolved. If you've ever felt whiplash from a character doing something completely weird and completely out of character, chances are good that the author in that case changed the character's emotional goal, likely unknowingly. Now, with this key established, let's move on to what role beliefs and misbeliefs play in motivation. Character motivation is made up of two components. First one is, you guessed it, the emotional goal that we just discussed. The second one is the character's belief about how to achieve that emotional goal. This is the second key in establishing a coherent character motivation. Let's look at some examples again. For Katniss from the Hunger Games, her emotional goal is to feel safe. Her belief is that she will accomplish this by protecting herself and those she cares about. For Jay Gatsby, his emotional goal is to feel validated, and he believes he'll accomplish this by being accepted into old money society. For Moana, her emotional goal is to feel at home, and she believes she'll accomplish this by embarking into the unknown of the ocean. The belief portion of your character development is often rooted in backstory, and we often, though not always, get to see that backstory. In Katniss's case, there's no flashback to explain why she believes what she believes. The present-day story narrative provides enough for the reader to understand it. For Gatsby and Moana, though, we do get a glimpse into their backstories that created why they believe what they do. If you are familiar with these stories, and also based on what I've mentioned before, you will notice that one out of these three fails to accomplish his emotional goal by following his belief. Yes, of course, I'm talking about Jay Gatsby. So depending on the story you're telling, your character may have a belief that leads them down the wrong path for actually accomplishing their emotional goal. You might have heard this referred to as the misbelief. In a tragedy, the story never lets the protagonist reach their emotional goal. The misbelief wins, so to speak. Whereas in a story that has a happy ending, but a character has a misbelief, that character will follow their misbelief, realize it fails to meet their emotional goal, change their belief, and fulfill their emotional goal with a changed belief. Depending on the story you're telling, sometimes it makes sense to have characters with misbeliefs, and sometimes it does not. That's honestly all there is to misbeliefs. But I'm also aware that for reasons that are more complex than I have time to go into, some writers believe that every character, especially the protagonist, has to have a misbelief. Look, if you're really telling stories where that's the case, keep going, great. But if you have come under the sway of this dictum, that your character must have a misbelief that is keeping them from reaching their emotional goal, and you're really struggling with that, here's the thing. Your characters don't need a misbelief. They absolutely can have one if the story you're telling is about them overcoming or succumbing to that misbelief, but they absolutely don't have to have one. It's not a necessity, and your character will not fall flat without one. Let's consider this even just from some basic narrative conflict theory. You know, the distinctions you might have learned in high school or middle school about the different types of conflict that can exist in a story. The list is person versus person, person versus society, versus nature, versus technology, versus the supernatural, versus fate, and person versus self. So of the 7 possible conflict types, there's only one that necessitates a misbelief for its construction. The others do not necessitate it. They can contain it, but don't need it. And the reason I have beef with this misbelief as an absolute dictum is because I have worked with writers who were really struggling and beating themselves up over the fact that they just couldn't figure out how to fit in a misbelief into their protagonists' arcs. And the mere attempts and narrative gymnastics it required were ruining They're otherwise great stories that were very much a person versus person and versus society conflict setup, with a great cast of characters. And seeing them trying to shoehorn in a misbelief was like watching a chef trying to add liver and onions to their cake mix. Liver and onions are great ingredients in other dishes, but by no means essential for every dish. You get my drift. The reality is, there are so many wonderful reasons characters struggle to reach their goals, and they have nothing to do with misbeliefs. This is also why a ton of really great characters and stories don't have misbeliefs either at all, or definitely not as the protagonist's conflict. Again, take Katniss, take Peeta, also from the Hunger Games. They don't have a misbelief about how to achieve their emotional goals. Holden Caulfield from The Catcher in the Rye does not have a misbelief. Empress Malini from the Burning Kingdoms trilogy does not have a misbelief. There are, of course, amazing characters who do have misbeliefs and overcome them, but the big point I want you to take away from this is that misbeliefs are one small tool that can fit your story if you are centering your conflict on the person versus self axis. I'd be really curious to know what you've been told about misbeliefs and what your experience is with them. Let me know in the comments. So to wrap up our key point, let's look at our hypothetical character Jeremy again. He wants to feel peaceful and feels annoyed at the beginning of the story. So I'm gonna say he believes that what will meet his emotional goal is being financially comfortable. You already know he grew up on a farm, and let's say his parents really struggled to make ends meet. In fact, that's why they had to sell his cow in the first place. So his rationale is that if he's not worried about making ends meet, or worried about losing a beloved companion to cover a debt, he will have peace of mind and will feel peaceful. Hence the belief that if he's financially comfortable, he will meet his emotional goal. Now, is that an accurate belief that will actually meet his emotional goal, or is it one that will lead him astray? Well, if I give you no other information about the setting that he's in, and whether I'm intending for this to be a tragedy or not, you can't really tell yet. I suspect you can think of an angle where it could go either way. The key that tends to decide where this motivational element leads would be my theme. What do I want to say about life with this story? That topic is beyond the scope of this video, but I'm going to discuss it in the next one. So if you're watching from the future, that next video is likely linked on the screen or maybe in the description below. Also, if you're finding value in these educational breakdowns, I'd love it if you hit the like and subscribe buttons. Thank you. Now that we've got the emotional goal and what the character believes will meet it, let's see how to integrate that with the plot. Chances are you already have a rough plot in mind for your story, and you've of course created your characters with that plot in mind. So the third key to coherent character motivation is ensuring that plot goals arise from the motivation. More specifically, your character's plot goal should be based directly on your character's belief. The best way to think about this is that the belief informs the actions that your character is willing to take in the course of the plot, while the character's emotional goal determines how they will react to their environment and to the outcomes of their actions. Here's an example for the belief aspect. Let's again look at Katniss, because I suspect that most of you are familiar with this story, even if it's just through the movie. So, as previously established, Katniss's emotional goal is to feel safe, and she believes she will do that by protecting herself and those she cares about. Katniss's long-term plot goal in the story is to survive the Hunger Games. But of course, as all long-term plot goals do, it breaks down into many immediate-term and short-term goals. Yet, every action she takes is consistent with her belief of protecting herself and those she cares about. A few of the climactic actions are her volunteering as tribute to protect her sister, her allying with Rue when it was clear that the girl could help her better protect herself, her then protecting Rue because she cared about her, and finally her refusing to kill Peeta because she cares about him and is protecting him. So you see how her belief is informing her actions. For the sake of a thought experiment, let's say that she believed she could keep herself safe by not drawing attention to herself. Well, her very first goal-oriented behavior in the story would still stand. She secretly hunts wild game to feed herself and her family. However, every other action would suddenly no longer make sense for a character who held this belief. She would not have volunteered as tribute in the first place, because that would be drawing attention to herself. She would not have shot an arrow at the game makers. The entire character and the entire story would change if we were just to change this one motivational element. So one big pitfall I often see in stories is that writers will have really cool plot points, but their character's belief only works for some of them. That's when you get the dreaded moment where the readers can tell from a mile away that a character is only doing a thing because of the plot. This is, of course, one of the hallmarks of weak characters. So to avoid that, make sure that whether you developed your plot or your characters first, you keep iterating on them until the plot actions that you want your characters to take coherently match up with what they believe will meet their emotional goals. Now, let's look at the emotional goal and how that connects to the plot. I'd said that the emotional goal determines how the character will react to their environment and the outcomes of their actions. Looking at Katniss again, her emotional goal in the story is to feel safe. But for the sake of illustration, let's swap it to she wants to feel powerful instead. Same belief about protecting herself and those she cares about. Can you picture how different her volunteering as tribute would look if the feeling that she was after was power rather than safety? Instead of the frantic terror that's there in the original, there might even be some deliberate bravado. Imagine how differently she might act when she kills another tribute. Instead of pure necessity, there might be some glee that she has bested them. And when she fails to protect Rue, she might be beating herself up for being weak. So even though using these two elements of emotional goal and belief for character motivation might seem simple on the surface, I hope you can see how far-reaching and impactful this is for your entire story. As a final tip about integrating character motivation into plot, let's talk about how to change your character's belief, if that suits your story. I'll remind you that the emotional goal remains unchanged for the duration of the story, but the plot goals can change a bunch of times. The belief, if it changes at all, tends to change only once and sometimes twice if you've got a redemption arc going. The key to changing the belief is showing your character's negative reaction when they almost reach the long-term goal that was based on their misbelief. As an example, let's go back to Jeremy, who grew up on the farm. He wants to feel peaceful and believes he'll accomplish this by having financial comfort. His plot goal is to get that promotion that will really bump his discretionary spending budget and his savings. He has a bunch of short-term and immediate-term plot goals that are working toward that promotion. Now, he gets that promotion, and he's happy, of course. But instead of feeling the peace he thought he would, he realizes he's anxious about all the projects that he has to get done. That rift of purported want and the reaction to its achievement is what will make the change of belief believable to the reader. Because remember, the reader pretty much only gets to see the plot goals and a little bit of the backstory that might illustrate the plot goals. It's in the character reactions where they see the true emotional goal. So once the reader sees Jeremy really doesn't want that promotion and doesn't want the level of financial comfort that he thought he wanted, they'll be cheering for him when he quits his job and moves back to the farm after realizing that spending more time with cows is what will actually meet his emotional goal. To recap, strong characters require a coherent motivation, and you can achieve that by giving them a clear emotional goal, a concrete belief about what will meet that emotional goal, whether that's accurate or not, and ensuring every plot goal is based on their current belief. If you manage to do this, your characters might not be able to bench press a cow, but they will feel strong and more real to your reader. My name is Tina. I'm a writer, writing coach, and recovering academic. Until next time, write on.